So, hello, I will be presenting Can Routine Data Extend Trials, the Art of Possible. I'm Danny, I'm a statistician at Swansea Trials Unit. And so in this presentation, I will go into a couple of initiatives that have been set up and have been touched on by the Cardiff team. And then I'll also then look at a couple of trials which have then used aspects of these initiatives. So just a little bit of the boiler stuff about the Swansea Trials Unit. We are a UK CRC registered trials unit. These are units set up to deliver rigorous research, and we've helped from the bid side to the governance, the data management, statistical sides in trials and routine data. So I'd first like to touch on the difference between a study and a trial. Typically in SAIL, you see more studies where we're exploring the treatment or situation of participants, but you don't influence the treatment or situation the participants receive. So these are more cohort and observational studies. Whereas an interventional trial, you're exploring a particular intervention. You design the trial to see the effects of this intervention and typically are randomizing the participant to these kind of interventions. These will include CTIMPs, surgical trials, device trials, and then other RCTs, randomized control trials. So I'll quickly look at the difference in the data that a trial, which I've shown by Stu, and then routine data typically collect and how they overlap. So quite often you'll have a trial that's collecting potentially quality of life data, information about adverse events for the safety side of the study, study specific. So this could be stuff like information about the polyps, stuff that isn't necessarily coded in routine data. You'll also have patient-reported outcome measures, potentially reviewing the case notes, and then also information about consent. Where the data overlaps is potentially information about the diagnoses people receive, operations they have, demographics, admissions and attendances that they have during the follow-ups, and also then the mortality of individuals. Where routine data differs can be collecting information regarding the residential, so who also lives at their address, and then linking them to those people. Information about substance misuse. It may not be in the trial data. Also information about the birth going back. Also things like the child receiving care and support, and also education. There's plenty more data sets available in routine. These are just an example of some of the things that may not typically be collected in a trial. And I'll go on to touch on initiatives where the overlap happens, as mentioned by the Cardiff team. How do these data sources compare, the data utility of them? So again, I'll first touch on the Primrose initiative. It's very much a rehash of what they've also said, but I'll just go into a bit more detail. So obviously, it's important. It's an initiative being led by the University of Liverpool, and it is looking at the points that researchers wanting to use routine data should consider, and in the development stage of the proposals. So it's are you getting the right? Is the governance there? Are you getting the right ethics and approval from the right organisation? If it's a trial, typically that's REC, but if you're starting to use routine data, you'll need to go to an IGRP, and vice versa. And then if you're using both sources, you may need to seek approval from both. And it's also important to be aware of the language and terminology used during these applications. They may differ, where there is potential confusion. Try and seek clarification or examples from the provider. It's just to try and make this process as easy as possible. You don't want any hiccups that prevent you getting the data. I mean, a common one may be, referring to something as a variable. They want to call it a data item. Try and use the terminology that is going to get you through with the least issues. It's also important to consider who you have as part of your team. Do you have people who understand what the data is going to look like, the structure, how to work with the data? Do you know how it's being collected? Do you have the skills to handle the data and manipulate it into the layout you require? And then do you also have the expertise to analyze, whether that's statistical or economic? Then you also have the data side of it. Does the data set require the information you need? There's no point requesting data sources. If I'm interested in operations, requesting emergency department data, make sure you're requesting the right data sources. If you're linking data, do you understand how you're going to do the split file process, uploading the data? making sure that the data sets you are requesting are going to answer your research question. And then there's also the quality of the assurance of the data. If you can reach out to the data provider and find out any information about the code, whether it's actually coded. Examples, if you're looking at the severity of something, you may know that it's coded, but are all those codes unspecified? If you're able to gauge that level of detail, and if it's important, something like severity, and it's just not coded, it may not be feasible to do your study. It's also important to be aware of the delays and lags between data being provided to the data providers and then you being able to access that data. An example of that is the education data. There's, I believe, a lag of a couple of years at the moment. So you aren't able to, if you wanted to explore the education institutions people are currently in, you won't be able to do that as there's delays in that data being provided. And it's also important to almost build in the time it will take to actually get approvals. Again, as the Cardiff team mentioned, this is important and can lead to time constraints towards the analysis phase where you've only just got the data and your study is almost ending. And it's also important to consider the preparation of your data set towards the end. Are you requesting some raw data and are you able to handle that data? Or are you wanting a data set you can literally just run the commands from and say, this is my output? And then also, again, the data utility comparisons, the DUX initiative. So this is an initiative being led by the University College London. And again, it is looking at whether or not routine data can be used in place of trial data, and it's exploring, the data agreement between the two sources. So it's an ongoing initiative with workshops being held early next year if anybody wanted to go. And it's looking at how the different data sources actually match up and whether or not you can use routine data in place of it. So I'll briefly go over a couple of benefits and limitations of routine data for trials. So first one, it's cheaper. If you're wanting to follow up thousands of participants, it's quite often a cheaper data collection method. And so obviously with the constraints and inflation of costs, it's quite often a better method for collecting the data. It's also less burdensome to patients. Some patients just are unable to attend visits and trials, and it can put them off, or it leads to loss to follow up at a later stage because they just can't make the visits. Whereas in routine data, the data you get is their attendances. It's when they have the issues. So it can be better in some instances. A benefit I've also missed off here is it can also identify larger cohorts, which we'll go into in one of the trials I explore later on. It's also important to be aware of the current limitations regarding routine data, the quality and reliability of the data coding. Obviously, if someone's just coding the data as unspecified, you aren't able to do much with that data. They potentially know what it is, but it's just, wouldn't say lazily coded, but the level of detail isn't there. You also have things around like ethnicity, where you'll potentially have conflicting ethnicity codes, which is an issue regarding demographics, which you don't necessarily have when you can physically go to the person and say, what is your ethnicity? So it's important to be aware of those issues and limitations regarding the routine data. You potentially won't be able to get the additional notes, the context around diagnoses and operations. It may be you want to know why they've had this operation, and you can, in a trial, you may be able to review the notes and say, this is the result of this, whereas that can be a more complicated story to do than just routine data where you have a code. There's not necessarily a clear logic of this has led to this. And that can be the same with potentially primary outcomes. You may be able to review the single diagnoses, but you may not know what's led to what, and it can depend on how people want to code the data. And it's also to be important, the limitations in the data availability. Again, as the Cardiff team said, the lags in data actually being made available. If it's important that you have to do safety reporting as for your trial, it may not be feasible to actually do using routine data due to the lags. Obviously, this may improve. However, currently trials where you have to do safety reporting and it can be a matter of days that you then have to make people aware, it's not feasible to necessarily do using routine data. And it's also important to be aware of the time it takes to get permissions for certain things from the IGRPs or in line with that. So I'll briefly now touch on the SAFER2 trial, which is one of the trials we've used using routine data and trial data. We'll just explore the difference in outcomes and then also the data utility comparisons between the trial and the routine data sources. So SAFER2 explored intervention exploring referrals to a fall service. So its primary outcome was prevalence of ED attendances and hospital admissions at the 1 and 6 months for identifiable data, which was trial data collected through case note reviews, and then also the overall data, which is going to be comprised of the trial and routine data. It also then looked at the data utility comparison side again in the next ED attendance dates, and also whether they had an event, and then the hospital admissions again, event and date matches, and then also the mortality data. So this is the primary outcome result data. So I'd first like to point out that the difference in actual cohort sizes in the identifiable, which is the trial data, compared to the overall, which is trial data and routine data. So they're able to gain an extra about 1,800 per arm through also identifying patients through the overall, through routine data and the trial data. And the other important thing to note here is that you can see in some of the p-values at the 6 months in the proportions with the further ED attendance, then also the hospital admissions at 1 and 6 months, is that actually the p-values change when you use a different source of data, which is quite important, that actually using all the data available and the larger cohort sample have actually led to different conclusions in the study, which was an interesting result. And then also this is then the utility side of it. So there were events that were identified in both the identifiable and also the anonymized, which is the routine data, that were identified in the other source. It's unclear why these weren't identified in the other source, potentially that the trial wasn't able to follow up participants, whereas the routine data was able to identify them and follow them up. And then you also have events which potentially aren't identified in anonymized data. It's unclear. This may be due to lags or potentially miscoding. It's unclear where this happens. However, we were able to identify events in both data sources for the same event. And then we saw agreements in dates between these for the subsequent ED attendance of 96%, so quite a good date match between the data sources. And then again, in the hospital admissions, we had a similar story where we saw an agreement of 90% between events that were identified in both sources. So again, it's establishing that, how reliably you potentially can be able to use an event that you've identified in your trial to identify it in a routine data. This may become important, if you're then looking at index date of operation, and then you want to identify that in your routine data for a cohort. So it's quite important to establish this to rely more on routine data in place of trial data. And again, we also have the mortality data. And it's important to pick out here that all the deaths in the trial were actually picked out for using the routine data. And there was an exact agreement on 696, so again, a much higher degree of agreement between the data sources here. There were some that were differed by a day or so, but generally they were all identified on the same day. And then routine data was also able to identify additional deaths. Again, it's unclear why this happens, whether this was close towards data collection ending where these patients died and they just weren't followed up, or they died at a different hospital and the research nurses weren't able to follow them up. So it's important to see that routine data can actually aid, and is generally regarding death, actually identifying the same information and probably can be used in place. Now, I'll briefly just talk about the X-Heart third trial, which stands for extending the heart follow-up using routine data. So the heart trial was set up about a decade ago, and originally looked at a primary outcome of around 12 months, where the Hughes abdominal closure reduced hernias following surgery. And then routine data was used to extend this to around 5 years after the index operation. So during the trial, we weren't able to access the HES data due to time and permission constraints in the study. So we were only able to actually link 267 of our cohort to Welsh domiciled ALFs, which we'll explore here. Obviously, this trial is currently still being requested out of sale, so I'm limited in what I can show you. So I do apologise on that front. So here we can just see how the data matches up. So again, I'd like to point out that all deaths during the trial, which is represented by the trial and ADD data sets, identified all the deaths in ADD. So again, supporting that the ADD data source, the deaths in sale is a good is good, and identifying the same deaths in the trial. But then ADD also identified additional deaths. Now, obviously, as it's extending the follow-up, we also tried to explore the reasons why these additional deaths were identified. So we saw that 2 deaths were after a patient was lost to follow-up, which the study wouldn't have been able to follow up, whereas due to the less burdensome follow-up of participants, routine data was able to improve this and identify additional patients. There was 15 patients which were after the final data collection time point and just could not be followed up. We wouldn't expect that. And then we also found that there was, again, 2 patients that died that we couldn't determine a reason for why it wasn't captured. It was within the study, but they weren't withdrawn or anything. So it's potentially worth exploring. This could have been towards the end of data collection, or could have just been the patient had finished the follow-up and weren't followed up any further. So we also had data of, again, talking to the utility and comparison of the data. We only collected the date of death in 23 of the participants, but we saw an agreement again around the 96% between the dates of death. And then again, the one that wasn't was an agreement within a week or so. So I'm just going to quickly round up this presentation. It's the conclusions to draw from routine data is it can lead to larger cohorts being identified for your intervention. It's a much more efficient and cheaper method of doing so as well. The data agreement between trial and routine data is good. It's not quite perfect at the individual level, but it's a good comparison. The analysis of identifiable data alone, can lead to different conclusions, as you can see from the routine data in SAFER 2. So it's important to be aware of, can you get additional data, understand the implications of that. But I would also like to say that the limitations that are picked out, these are improving as time's progressing. As the quality of coding is getting better, the approval process is getting better. There are limitations, but as long as you're aware of them, they aren't going to stop you from running the trial. It's just to be aware of that they, may affect the trial. So yeah, that's everything. Thank you very much.